Hi, my name is Jennifer Andrews-Weckerly. I am the rector of Hickory Neck Episcopal Church, just outside of Williamsburg, Virginia. I am so looking forward to meeting you in just a few weeks. I've answered this question a lot lately, and although I think there are hundreds of small reasons why I am called to be the 10th bishop of the Diocese of Iowa, the biggest reason really comes down to a sense of being well matched. I shared with your search committee that it's also often been recognized in me that there's a contradiction in my size and my presence. As a petite person, it is often noticed, but not something that I notice in my daily experience because it's just my incarnate reality. But for others, I think they see that contradiction and can be confused. So I get comments like, for such a petite person, you have such a big voice. Or for such a small person, you have such a large presence. And I've even had that Shakespeare quote given to me, though she be little, she is fierce. I see a similar incarnate contradiction in the Diocese of Iowa. Although you are a diocese with many small parishes, and even your larger parishes are small comparably to other dioceses, you do not allow your size to hinder your capacity for ministry. Quite the opposite. I find that you are a compilation of parishes who work hard, who are constantly being creative, thoughtful, showing a spirit of activity, and quite frankly, are what I would call scrappy, willing to get in there and try new things, and not to see challenges as barriers to ministry, but really opportunities for ministry. It's meant that as I've begun to think about us beginning new initiatives, we will have each other's backs, that we will experiment and try again until we find the right way forward. It means that when we have to have hard conversations, we'll do that respecting the dignity of one another. It also means that when there are times for celebration, our celebration may be outsized in the ways that we can be joyous together. There are certainly many gifts I believe I bring to the episcopate, but it is this similar disposition and approach to ministry that I see as the foundation of what could allow us to thrive in ministry together. So you may already know about me that I am a PK, a preacher's kid who grew up in the United Methodist Church. But what you may not know is that the churches that my dad served in were mostly rural parishes in North Carolina and Georgia, and they were mostly smaller parishes. That's the system that I grew up and was formed in and was shaped by in my early years in the church. In my young adulthood, I was a part of mostly urban, diverse, and inclusive churches whose very location in the heart of urban settings meant that ministry opportunities were always at the front door, usually taking the form of racial tensions, of the needs from poverty, and even from class struggles within the city. There was no way to really escape that sense of identity and urgency in ministry. And so that meant that all of our ministries, our formation, our service, and even our worship was impacted by that unique identity. In my ordained ministry, I have served mostly in suburban parishes of varying sizes, whether a corporate large parish with a large staff and endowment, or a pastoral church who found itself in a neighborhood with really experiencing the identity of being a religious minority, to a program sized parish who, although they did not have on their front steps the struggles of poverty, the struggles of the working class, or even racial tensions necessarily, we have worked through where those things are located and the ways in which they can be hidden in ministry settings. Across all those parishes that I've served in ordained life, they have been churches with widely varying political perspectives. That meant early on, I had to hone the expertise of preaching the good news of God in Christ to people who would hear that news very differently. It also meant that we often had to have very hard conversations about our differences and the ways that we approach particular issues. Sometimes those conversations led to irreconcilable differences, but for the most part, they led to deepened relationships, deepened respect, and deepened ability to work together, rooting ourselves around the reality of the Eucharistic table as our foundation for going out into the world and serving the gospel in our very different ways, but together as a community. I bring all of those experiences to the episcopate. So that means as I've worked in different settings and in different dioceses, I've learned that there are no cookie cutter answers to challenges and differences. I've learned that the good news of God in Christ is our lifeline as we do this work together. And I've also learned that the sacraments are what will feed us and sustain us in our work together. If we can be rooted in our baptismal identity, then we will be able to have those hard conversations across differences, both differences in political persuasions, theological persuasions, but even in the ways in which we live out our ministry based on our different sizes and settings. I believe this is really important work because it has the potential to go even beyond the work we're able to do across the diocese, to really be a witness to the entire state of Iowa about what it means to be a community of varying opinions and perspectives, but to continue to work for the greater good together. That kind of invitation is really exciting for me and is something that has been appealing to me throughout this discernment process. I have seen hope manifested in the Diocese of Iowa through what I've observed as a core value in the diocese. And that core value is the value of innovation. Now, you come by that core value honestly by being a missionary diocese in your very founding. You learn very quickly what it meant to be flexible, to make change, to pivot based on needs that arose as you began to grow the church. That innovation had to continue as you spread throughout the state of Iowa and began to plant churches in varying communities that had varying needs. As population began to decline eventually, as did resources, you had to continue that spirit of innovation and creativity as you developed new models for ministry, including your ministry development teams. And even in more recent years, you've continued that innovative spirit as you've joined together for revivals around the diocese, something unique in the Episcopal Church, and then taken that spirit and use it as an idea incubator and a capacity builder through offerings in Gilead. But nowhere have I seen a stronger sense of innovation than during this time of pandemic. You were fortunate to be prepared in having technology throughout the churches in the diocese, an advantage that many of us around the country did not have. So you were able to quickly enter into digital discipleship and evangelism. But you didn't stop there. As the diocese began to have offerings for all, you didn't just look to your well resourced parishes, but really opened up the opportunities for live streaming to churches throughout the diocese, including your less resource parishes, really creating opportunities for those parishes to have a much wider audience than they might have had before. That innovation has continued as you've walked outside of your doors during this time of pandemic. I've seen that in your ministries, in having a tree of masks that your neighbors could take as needed, in stepping up your feeding programs, and really looking at the needs of your specific communities. And let's not forget you starting an Episcopal discernment process in the midst of a pandemic when most people may have waited or retreated. You charged ahead and were willing to be creative and thoughtful and really make that process work. I think the challenge for the Diocese of Iowa is going to be to continue innovating. I don't know about you, but in my own communities and certainly in my church, I have heard the refrain more often than I can count. I just can't wait to go back to normal. Now, that's a response I totally understand and certainly have felt, particularly for us as restrictions have lessened in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I have felt some of the tension that I have been holding bodily also lessen. But the danger of the lure of returning back to normal is that we forget that normal wasn't great for everyone. If you remember, back in March 2020, we were a country who was deeply divided politically, who was struggling to have civil discourse. We were a country who was turning our backs on immigrants and making the plight of the poor even harder. We were a country who was slowly taking away the rights of women and the rights of the LGBTQ family members. We also forget that before this time, we have been in a system of racism that a large part of our communities have been suffering under for centuries. So the promise of returning to normal is not a promise of hope for many, and quite frankly, is not a promise for growth in the church. The church was also not in the greatest of places as we hit this pandemic. We were looking also at decline. We were resisting entering into the technological age, and we were a community who was a little nervous about meeting people where they are and being the church in new and different ways. The challenge for us forward is going to be to continue to embrace that core identity of innovation. Now, what's difficult about that is being an innovator isn't always easy, and it can certainly be exhausting. I know, especially this last year and a half, has been an exhausting experience for most of us. But what we have to remember is that we follow in the path of another innovator. When we think about the life and ministry of Jesus, he was a man constantly on the move, from community to community, engaging different people in different ways, and always pushing boundaries. He taught us that the life of ministry is one of restlessness, of constantly moving and trying new things. Now, that may seem a little overwhelming or intimidating, but remember, the way that a true innovator finds peace and encouragement in their work is by remembering that they hold on to core values at the center of all that they do. So, no matter what changes we are making, whatever programs we are trying, or different ways of being we are trying, at the center of that work is our core sense of identity, and that doesn't change. When we can remember that, we are emboldened to do the work we need to do, to consider those challenges then as sources of hope as well. Having grown up in the South, racism is a part of the fabric of our daily lives. Now, that doesn't mean that we necessarily like to talk about it. And in fact, there are many people who will say that we just need to move on from that conversation. But what that tendency involves is ignoring our long history and systemic subjugation of an entire community of people. Now, for many of us, when we think about racism, we remember the original sin of slavery. And that is certainly a part of our story. But what can happen is when we think about that history and the end of the Civil War, we can think that that system of slavery and system of sin ended. But in fact, that sin of racism just went underground, taking all different kinds of forms, from economic oppression, from political disadvantage, to physical intimidation, and emotional and psychological abuse. The experience of racism has been different for every generation, but that sin of racism has never actually gone away. I was blessed growing up by two parents who very patiently helped me wade through that moral dilemma, both as a child and as an adolescent in the South. My maternal grandmother tells the story of how she watched the marchers from Selma heading into Montgomery pass through her front window just outside of Montgomery, Alabama. My paternal grandmother tells the story of the bishop in our family tree who was a slave owner and who argued with the Methodist Church about the role of slavery in both the clergy and among the people, all because the slave that he owned was what he considered just part of the family. I attended a high school where there was an occasion in which the Black students were threatened by the KKK that they would be starting a disturbance at the end of the school day. And many of those students left early that day. All of that personal experience was what I brought to college and into my studies, both of African American history and urban politics. But it wasn't until college that I realized how much broader the story was. That racism was certainly experienced by our Black brothers and sisters, but it was also experienced by Latinos, Asian Americans, and especially by Indigenous Americans. I think that's part of why, after college, I entered into the nonprofit sector, because I could see the ways in which race, class, and gender would intersect to create hardship, whether it be food insecurity or housing instability. And so, in my work in the nonprofit sector, I was able to start chipping away, impacting individuals' lives in ways where race had brought up challenges for individuals that couldn't be remedied. Now, over time, I began to see that even with all of those individual efforts and the differences you could make in individual lives, that didn't negate the work that I needed to do internally on my own work around racism and the work that really all of us need to do if we're thinking about systemic change. For me, that has meant continuing my education, whether it's being involved in a race dialogue circle through an agency like the YWCA, whether it's meant in the church, that when we engage in outreach or mission, we talk about the ways in which race enter into our work. Whether it's engaging in a film series, a book study, a curriculum that allows us to talk about race in our communities, or whether it's taking programs like a diocesan anti-racism training, or most recently, a sacred ground circle in my own parish setting. I think all of that work is important for all of us to continue to do, and that is lifelong work. What's interesting to me, though, is the increasing conversation around the concept of reparations. Now, this is a concept that I think is loaded and can bring a lot of baggage to the conversation. It brings up all sorts of things from defensiveness to frustration to anger to a sense of futility or even a sense of being overwhelmed by the practicality of reparations. I've been very blessed to be a part of the Alumni Association's executive committee at my seminary, Virginia Theological Seminary, as they have begun the work of engaging in reparations. The seminary has been a really wonderful model about how this can look and how it can take place practically. I've been able to watch the seminary as they've had those hard conversations about how you contact families and reach back to those who maybe don't have a historical record or whose historical record is difficult to find. I've watched as the seminary has struggled, as donors have withheld their contributions out of opposition to the process. And I've watched the seminary struggle with the reality that there's only so much that individual reparations can do, and how we can engage in a much broader conversation about how reparations can happen more globally. This has been a really wonderful education for me in thinking about what are the tangible ways that we can begin to change systems. I am so glad to hear that the Diocese of Iowa has already begun these conversations, and I am so proud of the work that you are already doing. I would be honored to be a part of those efforts, and especially in encouraging and empowering leaders to continue both the conversation and the work that we need to do. I will say that part of my contribution would be making sure that we create safe spaces for us to discuss dissent, for us to engage in meaningful listening, and for us to continue to ground ourselves in the foundation of the Eucharistic table so that as we move forward, we do this work as a community together as one. I think part of my greatest joy as a church leader is helping people discern where their gifts can meet the world's needs. I so enjoy doing this discernment work with others and helping them hear and maybe name the nudge of the Holy Spirit, and then thinking through the practical ways in which they can engage that nudge and think differently, either about their vocation or about their ministries within the church. It's kind of become a little bit of a joke in most of the parishes where I've served that if Jennifer asks you for coffee, you should run the other way. Those are where I often have those conversations about where is God calling you now and how are you going out into the world serving and showing the love of God in your own unique way. What usually those coffees lead to is not a sense of being asked to do more work or take on another job, but really about how we can find joy in God's call for us. Once we shift the conversation that way, we find that there is the opportunity to not only enrich the individual's life, but to enrich the life of the church and our ministries out in the world. And to me, there's nothing more fun than that.